Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to our second virtual public talk. Today we have Adnaan Wasey. Adnaan is an Emmy Award-winning producer, director, and writer. He's known for championing the work of diverse creators. He's produced media for PBS, New York Times, Twitch, and Snapchat. And he's also known to be highly innovative. I know him as the executive producer of POV Digital a few years back, where he ran a lot of experiments. He's won awards, including Webbies, Shorties, Tellies, and now he's the recipient of the Rita Allen Fellowship for Science Communication. And there he's analyzing how popular media engages diverse audience with complex issues. Today, he's going to talk to us about persuasive entertainment. And he'll be on in a second.
All right, hello everyone. I just want to confirm that you can see my screen. Yes, I assume that's a yes. People are nodding. You can see my screen. So hi, thank you, Sarah, for having me. I'm really happy to be able to speak with you. I just want to acknowledge a couple people up front. One is the Rita Allen Foundation, which Sarah mentioned. Rita Allen Foundation is really an innovator in science engagement. They've spearheaded a fellowship collaborative that has that's embedding leaders in various science institutions, media institutions, and to connect science into civic life. And you can actually find out more about that at civicsciencefellows.org, just a plug for them. And I'm hosted by WGBH, which is the public media organization in Boston, and they are another innovator. They're the largest producer of primetime programming for PBS. It's the home of Nova and Frontline and American Experience and Antiques Roadshow and Masterpiece, and also also programs like Arthur and The World. So obviously a powerhouse and pretty awesome to be there. So we're at a very weird time, to say the least. We're at a point where we're about a month into American life being upended after this COVID pandemic, with the stay-at-home mandates and so on, and about 3 months after the first known case in this country, just for reference. And I just say that for reference because things are changing. And when we say things like when things are back to normal, that's becoming more and more of a punchline. But regardless, it's as good a time as any to look at how we as media makers who are trying to have an influence on society around critical issues can up our game. And I want to talk to you about an approach that I've been working on that we've started to implement for acute issues around things like misinformation, but also thinking about the long term for cultivating a culture of science and civic science. So, generally speaking, civic science is absent from the conversation. When I talk to journalists and documentarians and YouTube educators, they say they're too busy or their bosses don't care or it's just too much information. But there's decades of research that I'd like to pull from today. And so my core question is about how we can use media better to help engage people with complex issues. And like science, but it doesn't have to be science. I'm just using science as an example, and I hope you can sort of imagine your own content area applying, and seeing what can happen when we apply social science. So I also believe very strongly that we can't solve that problem without looking at the broad population, which I think is also been ignored, and are trying to address groups that have been not represented well in media. Whether that's women or African Americans or even conservatives, the disabled, Hispanic population. It's a very long list. So, the state of things today is that there's confusion and fear and misinformation, and inequality presumably is growing, and there's concerns about privacy, and throw in a little distrust with institutions. And on top of all of that, we are a scientifically illiterate society for the most part, which makes the problems worse if they didn't cause them in the first place. So there's this one statistic that really stood out for me, which is that 29% of Americans think COVID was made in a lab. The thing that's also a standout in terms of statistics is the people for whom that number is actually higher. It's higher for people like people with only a high school education, among Republicans, among people who for whom Fox News is their primary news source, for people who are millennial or Gen Z age, and that is obviously quite troubling, but it's also an opportunity of how we can potentially address that and fix that. I also come to pieces like realizing that we are not a country of news consumers. We're a country of entertainment consumers. And that was one of the first signs that there may be a possibility for science. We know that, for example, The Big Bang Theory, when it was on the air, was the #1 rated show on television. We know that Rick and Morty is the #1 show, the #1 comedy among millennials. And these are pointing to potential opportunities. So I want to start with this term that I'm calling fact-splaining, and I'm going to explain what that is. This is something fundamental that I hope, if you take away nothing and tune out in the next 30 seconds, you remember this term. It's something fundamental. It's this idea that when you have facts, the idea is that if you have the information, that you could deliver it to someone, and then they will fill an information deficit, and then they'll go do good things. The truth is that you've probably already decided what you want to think, even if you don't know it yet. And it's because it's not so simple. You don't just listen to facts and process them. The facts get actually filtered through a bunch of things: your values, your beliefs, your social identities, which means like your religion, your ideology, the culture, the beliefs of your inner circle. It doesn't matter how right the facts are or how many facts. Learning is entangled with your values, and you're going to protect your identity. That's just something that you're going to do as a human. And in fact, you can actually have the opposite intent when you deliver facts, which you may have heard of as called the backfire effect, which is hard, especially for journalists to believe, or people who are desperately trying to debunk lies or misinformation. And we've seen this in areas like climate change denial or anti-vaccination. When you give people more facts, it actually increases polarization when you compare groups like liberals versus conservatives. So to put this all into one bucket, you're more likely to believe what you feel and then seek to justify it. And when you're in a position of wanting to educate people, it's coming from an earnest place. You're a smart person. You have knowledge that you know makes you able to make better decisions about important things, and you want to share that with others. So that makes a lot of sense. But it's not the storyteller's job to deliver facts. It's your job to do the facts justice. And I think that's a real framing change of how we need to make media today. And there's another aspect to this as well, which is something I've come across with interviews and casual conversations, which is that the fact-splaining approach is also tied up with your identity as a visual communicator. So, there's usually an implicit value placed on how well you're able to convey facts, regardless of impact, because the assumption is that if you deliver facts, you will have impact. But I'm trying to tell you that's not a good assumption. So what do you do? I want to show you, or take you back to the 1960s and show you an example of what a kids commercial, it's a cereal commercial, would have looked like if you were watching on Saturday morning.
New Post Top 3 cereals in one. Cornflakes. One cereal tastes better than none. Crisp Rice. 2 cereals taste better than one. Wheat Flakes. 3 tastes best of all. What fun! New Post Top 3 cereals in one. 3 times the flavor. 3 times the fun.
And I just want to confirm again that that people could hear the audio. I hope you could hear the audio. Yes. Okay. Thanks. Okay. So at this time, okay. Thanks for all the feedback. So there was a TV producer at this time, and her name was Joan Gans Cooney, and she was looking at things like these advertising jingles. She saw that media and commercials around this time in the 60s was addicting, but the shows themselves around that time weren't very impactful, and actually there weren't very many. There weren't really national kids shows, and she was looking at kids television and kids education. She saw the slogans, she saw the product names on the screen, she saw the jingles, and she was just trying to synthesize, what could we do for children's education? And this was at a time when, in the 60s, when there was an achievement gap growing with disadvantaged children. She noticed that preschool children were not being motivated to learn. She also noted that the creation of kindergarten around that time was going to hurt those disadvantaged children more because of a teacher shortage. She also noted a lot of opportunities. So it wasn't just this. She saw things like the use of animals and puppets. This is Marshall Eisen. I actually don't know how to pronounce his name. There was a show called Toddle on a station in Philadelphia. Again, there was no real national show, so she was looking at local shows. And she also thought, I want to reach everyone. I don't just want to reach the disadvantaged kids. And she thought that if I can do that, then we could have something here for education. And she wrote this up in a report in 1966 called The Potential Uses of Television in Preschool Education. And within 3 years, this was 1966, within 3 years, in November 1969, we had this. And I'll play you a clip that shows you an example. This came from a few years later, but let's do it anyways. Is a giant in the field of children's education. She founded the Children's Television Workshop, which is essentially defined how children's education in media happens. And that was about 50 years ago. And so, you see what there is here. It's the music, it's the catchy songs, it's the repetition. Even the jokes. If you watch Sesame Street, at the end of the show, you would hear, today's episode is brought to you by the letter D and the number 2. This is the exact parlance of advertising that she co-opted and brought into children's education because she saw that's what was actually working. So here's what's happened since then, which is essentially nothing, very little, because that revolution that happened in children's education in the late 60s has essentially never happened in adult education. And this is 50 years later. So, I have this question that I'm asking of how do we reconcile education and entertainment for adults? Then the second question is there really a conflict? Because I don't really think there is. I think the answer is that if we actually focus first on entertainment, just as Joan Gans Cooney figured out, that actually could be a lot easier to deliver the information that we're trying to deliver to people, and we could reach a lot more people. Those groups that are not being reached by science media, or again, replace science with your particular interest. In the same way that Sesame Street was able to essentially reach everyone through the devices they had at that time, which was television. So that brings us to what this thing is. It's persuasive entertainment. It's the application of social science to mass media entertainment with the aim of increasing adult literacy around complex issues. My focus is on science, but again, I think it's applicable in multiple ways. And we know from decades of research, including what we've learned from children's education through media, that we know about narratives, we know about characters, we know about visuals, and we know that these things can have an impact to different degrees on attitudes, beliefs, and knowledge. We also know, like Cooney knew, that we can make use of the platforms that are available to us. We can use social media now. There are much more opportunities than just having delivery through morning television. So I'm going to walk you through what these pieces are and some examples, and hopefully we'll connect back to some of your own work. So the first piece I want to talk about is this first one that you're seeing here about relatability. This is pretty fundamental to an entree into entertainment, which is you don't have an audience if you can't. The audience will turn off if they can't relate to a character. People need to see themselves reflected in media, otherwise they won't watch, and nothing else you do will matter. So this is one of the first things to start from. The messenger really matters, if you are in an ideological conservative setting, for example, a medical doctor is going to have a lot more credibility than a research scientist. The messenger matters. In fiction, that means constructing characters. In nonfiction, which is a lot less of what I'm talking about today, but in nonfiction, that means casting. So you know this when you're, for those of you who are documentary filmmakers, your characters have to resonate with people. Otherwise, you don't have a film. So, and with nonfiction storytelling, another parameter comes into play called parasocial interactions, which essentially means imagined friendships. And this is one of the things that connects us to YouTubers, and it connects us to reality TV stars. It also connects us to celebrities via gossip media. And going back to that value filter, an audience member is going to connect with a character on a fiction TV show because of the values they exude in the roles that they play. And there's a continuum of this interaction with a character as well. So, you could have just a liking of a character, but you could also strive to be like them, which is really useful in persuasion, all the way to fan worship, which is an extreme form of that parasocial interaction. And you could probably place yourself on a spectrum for your favorite show and favorite characters. So, like I said, characters have to match who we're trying to reach. So if we're trying to reach an audience of high school only educated people, is it helpful to have a PhD research scientist explain things? Pretty clearly, no. Conservatives are not well represented in science media. Women are not well represented. African Americans, down the line, you get it. If you can reach the big groups in the same way that Cooney tried to reach the disadvantaged children, if we can reach those groups, like the conservatives that are not being reached, and not turn off the elite groups, then I think we're onto something. And it turns out TV shows actually have an ideological fingerprint as well. And we can actually look at traits of television and map them onto ideological traits and actually predict the ideology of an audience. And the flip of that is we can actually design television series to reach audiences that wouldn't watch science TV by understanding what those traits are, incorporating them into the shows. And we actually have mapped a lot of shows. This is a condensation of some of those things. I can decode this graph for you. So from the left side is bad science in quotes, and on the right side is good science. The top is conservative, or is more conservative, and the bottom is more liberal. So the top left is what you would expect of sort of a conservative leaning show. Probably is not going to be as strong with science. On the bottom left, I'm glad not to see anything there, because that's a place where liberals you would think would be conscientious about science. So that's good that there's nothing there. The yellow zone is, okay, you might learn something, but what we really want to be in is this green zone, which is ideal. It means we're reaching everyone across the spectrum of ideology, or whatever your sort of spectrum is of who you're trying to reach and who you're not reaching, but also have the quality of the content be good. And I can show you an example of something that is maybe not so good.
I believe I've made some progress on our ground rules.
Oh, good. What are they?
Okay, number one, in matters of physics, I have the final say. Now, in matters of neuroscience, you have the final say, unless I disagree. Oh, here. Number two, when we publish, my name goes first. Oh, subsequently, if we win any awards, I speak first. I don't want to be talking when the orchestra plays us off.
Can I see that?
Of course.
So that's, of course, The Big Bang Theory, which is a beloved show. Again, one of the highest rated shows on television when it was on, if not the highest rated show, depending on how you count these things. But it fails in a lot of ways. One example is, which I think is indicative of the science on the show, is that it's a show where women don't have last names. And that's the kind of thing that actually kind of resonates or reverberates through the show, through potentially like misogynistic thoughts and the idea that the men are better at science than the women, and that women have to work at the Cheesecake Factory. Meanwhile, these men somehow magically have funding for all of their work. And there's something interesting else that's going on here, which is even if a character is calling out the potential misogyny, it actually serves to reinforce the negative message, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But so getting back to the conservative traits, we can actually break things down, and I can tell you, generally speaking, I can tell you that there are conservative TV shows traits. Like, we know that conservatives are more likely to watch an episodic show versus a serialized show. We know that conservatives are more likely to like shows that have hierarchical structures, that have clear morality, that show physical danger as opposed to existential danger, and also that are non-diverse, just reality of what people like. I'm generalizing, and we can actually take these and again look back at the shows and look at where shows generally are in the landscape today and where we might be able to see improvement. And what I'm trying to do is actually take a few of these kinds of shows, specifically animation, specifically sci-fi and procedurals, and see if we can't get the procedurals to be a little more, probably a little more liberal or more sort of central, and obviously pushing towards the right, which is good science. Animation, generally speaking, is pretty liberal. So to move that into conservative territory, and again, more science. And sci-fi is also usually much more liberal, and again, trying to move that up and to the right. And that's where we're trying to be. That's sort of the ideal place. And if you can look at this chart, there really isn't a lot there, but I want to show an example of something that I think is really great. And it's Manhunt Unabomber, which was a mini series about catching the Unabomber. And it was great because it was a show about a person arguing for the scientific method and a new form of science. At the same time, it was wrapped up in essentially a true crime story, which is one of the biggest news stories of 25-ish years ago. So I want to show you just a 1-minute clip from that. Let's try again here. Oh, this is too short. Okay, wrong clip. In this clip, what would happen is our main character, who's this FBI agent, actually goes into the room with the other FBI agents, and the FBI agents say, give me real science, like do real forensics. And he argues this is actually forensics. And this is kind of the point of the whole show, while the manhunt was going on, that he's arguing for the scientific method and a new form of science. It's really one of the few shows that you can see that actually ranks highly. We think that the shows that we're making, might actually be in this 90 or 100 territory, maybe 80, but this is what we're aiming for. And so when we're trying to reach our audience, we're also thinking about who we're reaching. The first show that's going to come out is actually a show about dating. Because the Tinder generation lines up really well with this younger demographic that we're trying to reach. And just as an example, so everything that we're doing comes out of the idea of how we're reaching this audience. So it's a broad demographic. It's including all these groups that I talked about. Hopefully we're reaching all of them. It's sort of a middle of the road sort of show in terms of it's not a liberal show. It's not a conservative show. We actually have set the show in Omaha, Nebraska for one thing. And it has scientists who are not really scientists, but they're scientists. So trying to make these characters relatable to a broad audience, this Tinder generation. And that's what we're trying to do. Also wrapped up with the audience, of course, is the platform. So, being very aware that this audience that we're trying to reach, this millennial and Gen Z audience, they're online, they are watching online videos, they're on social media. It would be very strange for this show to be on television. It makes much more sense for it to be on a streaming service or social media. And I want to show an example also from a show that my colleagues made. It was a show that I sort of created and then handed off to another group, the Emerging Platforms group at WGBH, who produced a pilot for a show called Escape Lab. And Escape Lab was a game show made for Twitch. The idea was that you're trying to amp up those parasocial interactions. Things like having comedians or influencers play these games, and that would resonate with the audience, and that they'd have fun watching because they're relating to the characters. So I'm just going to show a very short clip from this.
I like the idea of making experiences that get people to reflect upon the world around them, and escape games are one great way of doing that.
Astronauts panic in space.
No way, this is so cool.
Okay, there's gotta be something else that we're missing.
You're working on something over here.
Without your participation, Twitch, these folks will never escape. Our Twitch audience suggests that you can find the key at the top of the hatch.
At the top of the hatch.
Got it. Oh my goodness. All right, thanks,
Great. Oh, yes.
Star Tracker navigation system is damaged, and we're gonna have to navigate by constellation.
Star Tracker successfully programmed.
Push launch.
Woo! We're going back to Earth.
All right. The winning team is Team Beyond.
So that was just a quick clip and an awesome show produced by the Emerging Platforms unit at WGBH, which you can check out. It's on Twitch, and you can search for Escape Lab and watch the pilot. So yeah, I didn't want to just give examples from fiction, because there's a lot that translates to nonfiction. The big difference between nonfiction and fiction, with everything I'm talking about, is this idea of the parasocial interactions, which we can talk about more. So just summarizing relatability. When characters endear themselves to the viewers will aspire to their values and beliefs. And that's your entree, like I said. And a tip to pull from this social science piece is to construct characters out of the beliefs held by your audience, and then you're starting from somewhere. Next point is memes and images. So when I ask you, if I were to ask you what does a scientist look like, and if you think about that for a second, you probably already have an image of your mind, and the assumption is you probably thought of someone like this. I'm showing a mix of obviously media images and stock images. And actually I can show you that I did a search just for the term scientist on a stock site, and this is what came up. Old, white male, glasses, lab coat, goggles, crazy hair, balding. They'll have traits like nerdy, awkward, not social, not a family person, focused on science problems. This obviously is not really what scientists look like. Some of them, sure, but for the most part, no. But it's the stereotype. And the thing is that when we don't see images we don't see things in reality, if we don't have those images in front of us, our views of those things are shaped by what we see in popular media. And they persist in culture. For those of you who study this, it's called cultivation theory. And science is just an example. You can probably imagine if you have a particular niche field that you're interested in, that the same thing is happening there. The image of scientists was actually improving until we had the Sheldon Coopers from the Big Bang Theory and the Rick Sanchez's from Rick and Morty. Those are, again, two of the most popular shows on television, and they have a tremendously negative impact on our views. Which were formed around the 50s through the 70s. And a lot of those images that came from science fiction from that time have lasted and have turned into tropes. But when I look at what a scientist looks like today, if I asked you, 3 months ago to name a real scientist, like not a fictional scientist, which is actually a lot easier, you would have had a lot of trouble. You might have said Stephen Hawking. And if I said living, then Stephen Hawking doesn't count because he has passed away. But today, there's something strange happening, which is that scientists now look like this. We've got Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, and they're actually kind of hearkening back to a time from the earliest days in science television when we had people like Lynn Poole, and maybe you actually know the person on the right. You're more likely to know the person on the right, which is Mr. Wizard. Watch Mr. Wizard. These are the sort of avuncular, next door neighborly kind of science communicators that we have not really had because they've been replaced by those images from sci-fi. So I wonder if there's an opportunity here. You know, I think one of my favorite examples of a positive portrayal of a scientist was Dana Scully, and we know from research done a couple of years ago that Dana Scully actually had a tremendous influence on women entering STEM, science, technology, engineering, math professions, or school. And I'm troubled by what kind of impact the Sheldon Coopers are having and the Rick Sanchez's are happening, you know, at the cost of you know, entering into science. So there's a new opportunity. We can recultivate these images, and actually we can do it with media. The Big Bang Theory is off the air. Rick and Morty is going very well. It's going strong. It's going to keep going for a while, but maybe there are other opportunities piggybacking off of images of people like Dr. Fauci, who is everywhere. You know, he gets it. He's on YouTube. He's talking to NBA stars. He's on late night talk shows. You know, in addition to the traditional news media. You know, we've got a list of tropes. In science, they're very easy to compile. You know, like the crazy hair and goggles, and you may have more difficulty in your field to determine if, you know, which tropes are the most harmful, but the shows that I've written and the ones that I'm writing now actually are very conscious of those stereotypes and those tropes. So, you know, is there a lead scientist that's a woman? Yes, probably always there is. You know, they're not old. They're not only focused on their science problems. There's no mad scientists, and so on. It's and you know, also the authenticity and accuracy also actually helps with the storytelling. We're trying to fight those stereotypes. Summarizing that, mass media images, persistent culture, and you can create all of your images conscientiously, which is something that we are absolutely doing. Every little thing matters, and there's meta narratives to be concerned about as well. There are some things that are happening right now also around COVID-19 that we're hearing a lot of phrases like some of the first phrases I heard were "don't touch your face" and "flatten the curve," and now there's "stay home" and things like "alone together" and "social distancing" and WFH. And then there are the numbers. So for example, 6 feet. The 6 feet rule, keep 6 feet apart. We've got 20 seconds. You know what this means, hand washing for 20 seconds. 14 days, you know what 14 days means. 18 months, you know what 18 months also means. All these things are actually simplifying and potentially exemplifying the ideas. You know, if we had conflicting information about actually now we're having more conflicting information, but conflicting information about how long should you wash your hands? Is it 15 seconds, 20 seconds, 25 seconds, 1 hour? Or like, you know, it would be a lot more confusing. But what we have actually done is sort of a group has decided that these are the right numbers. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just pointing out that there's rigidity to them, and that the numbers sound believable, and they're easy to remember. They're easy to repeat. They're easy to be upset about if you want to be upset about them. And you know, in science, there's, and again, in your field, there may be other pernicious messages. So there's a pernicious message in science, and I can phrase it this way. So if I asked you to think about the first word that comes to mind when I say science is, and if you think about that, maybe you already have a thought or think about it. I know a lot of people don't have an answer to that question, but science is. Maybe you said cool, you're a cooler group, maybe you said cool. A lot of people are gonna say hard, difficult, not for me. It's actually socially acceptable to say that science is hard, and it's actually a dangerous meme that actually prevents high school students from wanting to pursue science in college. And I'm trying to think about what we can do to counter that message, again, by using these persuasive entertainment techniques. We want to replace the message that science is hard with science is a process, which is much more correct. And use some of these same ideas that Joan Gans-Cooney taught us about repetition from advertising, using memes, hashtags, viral posts. These are the opportunities we have today. in any fiction show that I'm creating now, we actually there's actually an emphasis on creating the repeatable language. So in one case, the titles of the episodes are the repeatable phrases. So anytime the episodes move around the internet or get shared or written about, the language is actually unavoidable. And this again is something that we were taking from advertising. Simple, clear, on-point language. It's the equivalent of just do it or got milk. That can make brands. I showed a cereal commercial. The notion that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, that's also an invention. So marketers have been using these techniques, and we know there's tremendous power. As we move on to, or just wrapping up with this idea, is that simplification is a good thing. We can exemplify, which is something that actually we do in documentary all the time. We tell a specific story about one person to tell a broader story about an issue. That's actually the same thing. It's framing, it's simplifying, it's exemplifying. We can do that and embrace the opportunities to make things easier for people to understand without resorting to oversimplification, which is something that is just as true in fiction as it is nonfiction. Again, this is very counterintuitive. You think that we want to give people as much facts and detail as possible, but the reality is that it doesn't work that way. People do not gain knowledge specifically, effectively from media. It's something they seek out, which is the next point, which is curiosity. So curiosity is something that we're trying to cultivate in fiction. And again, very simplified, but the basic idea is that if something is too easy for someone, I know that it's kid stuff, it's below my education level, it's boring, it's not gonna be interesting, it's not gonna spike any sort of curiosity. On the other extreme, if something is really arcane, at a PhD level, when you are not at a PhD level, it's just too hard, you're not gonna grab it. And you wanna be obviously in this middle area where there's something that's just kind of within grasp. And this is, again, taken from advertising. When there's new products that are introduced, this is actually where you want things to be. You want to sort of spike people's interest because they're like, oh, that's an interesting product. I want to find out more about it, and have this information-seeking behavior, which is another word for curiosity. And we're trying to do this in the shows that we're making now too. So we're trying to cultivate curiosity. The first show that's going to come out is a cartoon. We're actually focusing on novelty, but at a simplified level, and disruptive science to be sort of pique people's curiosity. So these topics that sound very difficult, but they're intriguing, I hope, the way that we're presenting them. Algorithmic bias and artificial intelligence, the reproducibility crisis, blockchain, quantum computers, CRISPR, the microbiome. These are all ideas that are novel. They're new science, they're disruptive science. But we're not trying to give people a PhD level education in any of these things. We're just trying to introduce the most basic ideas through allegory and narrative of what they are. And hopefully that cultivates people's curiosity to go seek out the information on their own. So we can summarize this by saying that humans like to know and they like to find out. So aim for that moderate information gap so that audiences can aspire to conquer this gap. And again, like there's a lot of things that are dovetailing. Repetition helps to cultivate curiosity. There's an idea here that we're trying to do more of, which is called processing fluency. The idea here is we're trying to get people to be primed for information, which we're going to talk about next, and give people just enough to be interested in, but not too much to be overwhelmed or feel anxiety, which is another term they use. Let's talk about anxiety of having too much information and wanting to turn off and not being curious. So moving on to priming, we have an idea that we are, again, if we are a traditional educator, we are thinking about probably two groups. We're thinking about the group that kind of knows things pretty well and trying to give people more information. It's sort of like if you have a ladder of engagement or a pyramid of engagement, you're trying to figure out how can we get people to become from knowledgeable to become activists. A lot of people in education will also focus on the fence sitters. If we can just give them a little bit of information, again, fact splitting, if we just give them a little bit of information, maybe we can turn them over to our side. What I'm trying to actually get to is something else. So the first group that I mentioned is this A to A plus group, activism. the C to B group is that middle fence sitting group, trying to give them knowledge. I'm trying to actually reach people who are potentially even opposed to this science concept. I'm trying to get people from an F to a D. That doesn't mean that they're dumb, because I'm certainly an F to a D with a lot of things. It just means that that's where we're at, and we cannot be certain that that group is going to become activists. They are at a place where we can't teach them. We have to, the fact explaining doesn't work on them. We have to start from a more baseline level of things like talking about attitudes and beliefs. And this is the heart of everything that we're trying to do. We're not trying to teach people everything. Again, very counterintuitive. I don't want to teach people very much at all. What I want to do is have people feel more confident and comfortable, because we know that when people are more comfortable with subject matter, they actually do better. So, for example, college students that watch a scientific television show may not learn anything from that science show, but they'll feel more confident in that subject matter, and they actually will score better on tests. So it's a weird thing where we're not actually trying to teach people, and actually through media, it may be a bad idea to teach people things. And the research has shown so far actually backs us up that the knowledge part, actually there isn't really much of a change with entertainment media, but the attitudes and beliefs absolutely do change. So again, the social science data is backing up this idea that the fact explaining does not work, that we should not aim for knowledge, we should be aiming for something more fundamental, which is attitudes and beliefs. So just summarizing this, fans of STEM programs, science, technology, entertainment, engineering, math programs were primed to be more comfortable with STEM, which led to higher achievement. And it's enough in the media that we're making to make people comfortable with the subject matter, and let those pieces like curiosity, let people find that information for themselves or seek it out. So there's another part, which is actually a major part, and it's usually the biggest thing that I talk about. It's called immersion, or sometimes called narrative transportation. And this is one of those things where we know it intuitively. We know that when you read a great book or when you watch a movie, when you get lost in the story, that something different happens, some process that's different happens. What social scientists have known for about 20 years is that when you are lost in a story, you are more likely to take on that character's worldview, which can actually impact your attitudes and beliefs in the real world. And so this just comes down to, comes down to this one big factor, which is your story good? Is your story entertaining? And this is a thing that we in the documentary field would say over and over again, that storytelling matters. In journalism, you see the same thing. And this is why it really matters, because when you can have that relatable character that goes on a journey that does many of these other things we're talking about, if you can turn on this immersion thing, this narrative transportation thing, we can actually persuade people, because people are more susceptible to those messages. When a character goes on a journey and learns something, you're more likely to learn that thing when you come back into the real world. And this is a place, again, where it's glossed over in a lot of the conversations. There is actually data to back this up. It's a little too much for today to tell you this, but we can talk about it still. And there's one other piece, which is humor. And actually, humor is one of those things that has not been studied as much, but there is a thought that because humor is memorable, that it could be more effective than the didactic television that we have now for educating general audiences. And this is one of those places where it's much more hypothetical from my perspective. Everything else has a lot of data to back it up, which is why we're actually making a comedy. The first show is actually a comedy that you'll see soon, hopefully. And we'll test whether humor is doing something there. So just summarizing, to come back to where we were, which is to talk about relatability, which is your entree, then all of these story pieces, themes, simplification, immersion, priming, curiosity, humor, which all together is essentially entertainment. And if you forget everything, if you make an entertaining story, then you have an opportunity to impact a viewer based on their attitudes and beliefs, and you have these outcomes. Again, knowledge is the harder part, but these are the things that we're aiming for. So I did want to end with a clip from Contagion. Maybe while we're chatting, I'll try to pull up a clip in a different app. But the general thought is that it's much more engaging to hear about a concept like R naught, how quickly a bug can spread. It's much more interesting to hear that in a dramatic way than it is to hear it from a PhD scientist in a YouTube video just sort of telling you. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll try to come back and play some media, but I'm happy to have this conversation continue.
Thank you. That was wonderful, Adnaan. Fascinating talk. We're now going to take questions from the panelists or the attendees. If you have one, just raise your hand. I see one in the attendee list. And also panelists too, you can raise your hand. So I'm going to start actually with a question I have, which is, this really interesting talk, and you had talked about also this idea that they like to, you give them some information, but then they like to find some themselves. And I know you come from interactive, and I was curious, I know you're starting with comedy and cartoon, but have you thought about interactive media and how this might fit into this? And my second question is around polarization, and if you've thought more about how you're going to reach conservatives, if, for instance, you're doing this from WGBH and, it has a certain audience.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So, the question about interactive media, I think the way that I think about interactive media today is that all of you interactive media makers out there in this world that's become much more digital, you are the people who are actually able to take some of these concepts and implement them now, because a lot of my ideas require a set. I was supposed to be directing a show next week, which is not happening now, and we're trying to figure out how do we take some of those things that I know from interactive media and turn this into a more digital production. But I think all these things still apply. So, understanding your audience, you're well adapted to use social media. Something I didn't point out with Escape Lab was something that, one of the reasons why Twitch was so exciting as a platform is because it actually had all the interactivity. And if you saw, in that clip from the sizzle reel that I showed, there's a lot of stuff going on there. There's polls, the comments are very active. There's the screen can turn into hotspots. There's actually a lot of interactivity built into Twitch. And Sarah, you probably recall about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it was pretty clear to me that I should be shifting all my work over to social media, because all those things that we used to be doing on the web browser, we don't have the audience in the web browser. We actually have the audience on social media platforms. We should not give in to Facebook, but that there are opportunities to make use of with platforms. And Twitch was really nice because it had all those interactive opportunities. But yeah, to go back to my first point, I just think right now, in the world that we're in right now, where we are in a digital world, and really that's the way we're functioning, this group that's on this webinar right now are the ones that are able to implement these things right now. Your second question about conservatives is everything that I said. Just say it in a simple way, which is all these pieces are things that are going to help us reach across ideology. The polarization sometimes comes from fact-splaining. So there have been many cases, I didn't cite them specifically, but examples like about climate change or anti-vaccination, where the more educated you are, the more facts you receive, the more polarized you become, which is crazy when you think about it. And the smarter you are, the more likely you are to believe what you already believed. So, but all these factors are there, and something that I've been looking at is really examining the values and beliefs specifically. So, constructing characters that are relatable to a broad audience. Again, things like placing the show in Omaha as opposed to New York City or Los Angeles is a big thing. We're also filtering a lot of the settings and situations against, like, is this really a liberal setting or a conservative setting? And then again, taking all those traits that we know from that analysis of ideological traits and from things like moral foundation theory, and just trying to understand what we can map onto different ideologies. And I'm talking about this in the context of conservatives because it's such a big group, but the reality is you can map these sort of traits across whatever group you're unable to reach. So it could be a demographic audience, and we think we've solved that by moving from television to social media, but you've got to sort of map that out and figure out where those are. But there are certainly a lot of things we know about generalizing what a conservative could like.
Great. There's a bunch of questions. We have a question from Matt, who's an attendee. Claudia, do you want to bring up Matt? Matt, you're on.
Yes, hi. Very
Hi, Matt.
interesting talk, and I like your scientific approach to talking about entertainment. Your point about not giving too much information. I understand you don't want to overwhelm people, but I notice a tendency in announcements and other cases where information is left out that you would expect would normally be there. Now, this may not apply to the actual work you're doing, but so, for example, I see announcements about meetings. You know, it used to be real face-to-face, but now online meetings, and sometimes it leaves out when it's going to be or what time it's going to be, but there's just a web link. And to me, it strikes me as a kind of manipulation. If you're reading about the meeting, it doesn't take more than a sentence or two to put in when it is or how to get there, unless it's complicated. And so I think there's a disadvantage in leaving out too much information. And frankly, I don't see related, but not quite the same. I would like to see more emphasis on putting details set off from the main point so that people who like details, such as I do, can look into that smaller print, fine print, you know, whatever. I mean, hyperlinks can accomplish that to some extent, but leaving information too vague, I think, has a disadvantage.
So thanks, Matt. I get your question. I mean, I think it's more a question for meeting organizers, but I think but I want to piggyback on your question. So, you know, there is definitely a framing that happens, and when you decide which facts to include and which facts to not include, you actually are framing the situation, and that's actually a very useful thing in terms of exemplification, that you're simplifying what you're sharing. Again, a little different, but I'm just piggybacking on what you said. The manipulation angle. You know, a lot of people, when I tell people this for the first time, they say, oh, you're manipulating people, and oh, it's propaganda. And the truth is that it uses the same techniques that are actually being used for evil right now, and we're using it for good. But the thing that's actually different between persuasive entertainment and propaganda is that we're not manipulating people. That's actually the difference. The aim is not to manipulate them. The aim is much more benevolent. And another point, again, just piggybacking, it's a little bit of a tangent, but you know, when you're missing information, and you want information. So this group is a self-selected group that's decided to be a part of this webinar. You know, I could have delivered facts to you, and fact-splaining actually would have worked because you're a captive audience. You're really interested. You want to know. Fact-splaining does work for audiences, but it doesn't work when, you know, people are not sure, or they're sort of passive there, or they're anti whatever your subject matter is. So I'm sorry I'm not answering your question directly, but it actually had a lot of things I could piggyback off of.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. We have another question. What kind of AI do you use to identify what causes curiosity to audiences?
I think there may be a little bit of a jumble in that question. We're not using artificial intelligence. I mean, any of the processing we're doing is, you know, very kind of this linear algebra. Actually, there's a little bit of PCA analysis, which is a little technical, but we're not actually using any AI to identify what causes the curiosity. We're just trying to, as a writer, I'm trying to figure out what's that middle ground area that's not too difficult and not too easy.
Great. We have another question. What does hierarchical structure mean for a show?
Okay, gotcha. So the hierarchical structure are things like a military structure, or, you know, it's why a lot of the conservative shows are cop shows and military shows, because they have that hierarchy. It could be an office hierarchy as well. And the thing that's really interesting about the appeal of the hierarchical structures for conservative audiences is that when there's a main character or like a villain character that breaks that hierarchy, it actually reinforces the hierarchy, so it becomes actually more appealing to a conservative. So, example like a show like Homeland, or a show like The Blacklist, where you have rogue characters, they actually, by breaking out of the hierarchy, they actually reinforce the hierarchy. But that's what I meant. So it's sort of hierarchical structures, like a military structure or a. I mean, that's a great example.
Great. And we have a question from Sam, our panelist.
Hi, I have 2 questions, so feel free to just pick and choose. The first one is for social media in general, and then things that are live like Twitch, your moderator approaches and what your general strategy is for dealing with things like trolls and disruption. And then I'm also interested if any examples you might have of your work where you've partnered with like religious groups or other organizations to co-create something, if that's happened.
Yeah, great. So, I didn't run that show. It was produced by another group. The thing that's really interesting about communities is there's probably a lot of people here who've been community managers, presumably, or have had to deal with social media trolls. You set up a structure where there's as much of a civil conversation as you can have. The thing that I know about Escape Lab, I can't speak for them, but just from what I've heard from talking to them, is that the group was very positive, and they want the show to be great. Mostly the people that are there are fans of the show, and there's a self-policing that happens. I worked on a project a few years ago called the Whiteness Project, which some of you may remember, which we presented at MIT actually a few years ago. And the thing that was really funny is that it was a very kind of provocative project, but the group was actually self-policing, and that's ideal. I can't say that's always going to happen on projects, but specific strategies and tactics for managing trolls is another conversation. In terms of religious groups, we're not actively working with religious groups as consultants, but as part of my research, I've absolutely interviewed conservatives and people who are religious to try to understand their approaches to reaching, for example, to reach a conservative audience or religious audience around. I'm sorry, I'm putting those two things together because they overlap so much. But we'll speak to a church, and this is actually an exact example that I gave, that in a church setting, it's not helpful for you to bring in a scientist. It's much more helpful to bring in a local doctor who's going to be much more trusted. So we're not working with any religious groups right now, but have processed that kind of information from talking to conservatives who've had to communicate science and have done so quite effectively.
Great. We have a lot of questions here. Karen Feinberg, you're on. You have a question, Karen?
Oh, hello. Hi.
Hi,
I
Karen.
had written it. Hi. I'm talking to you from the epicenter of the COVID, New York, New Jersey area. And I, when I was at Harvard and I would attend, for instance, the social inequality series at the Kennedy School, I always wanted to immerse myself in what the social scientist was presenting. And the minute they presented, with all due respect to any of you who uses regression models, I wanted to fall asleep every time, and you lost me. And so I wondered if you would consider, or have you done actual trainings? And I always thought about this because part of my background was working in and with film. And so I've thought about this a lot, this kind of question, which is why I'm on here today to learn more, to train social scientists to use different modes to communicate, because the social science they're doing is pretty important stuff often, but it gets lost in translation so often. So I wonder if you have done that, would you consider doing that? I think it would be a really cool thing to bridge.
Yeah, so Karen, thanks for the question. Obviously, this is a problem. So, I'm presenting, without going into the details of the numbers, I've been presenting work from decades of work. I did not present charts because maybe this group would have been okay, but that's just definitely generally not my mode of operation. What you're suggesting about training scientists is the bulk of what is happening in the science communication field. It's happening. There are groups like the Alan Alda Center, not too far away from me. Compass, which is I think based in Seattle. Their job is to train people. One of my colleagues at WGBH, that's another thing that she does, one of the Civic Science Fellows. She trains people. That's basically what people do. So that's actually the bulk of science communication. From my perspective, I'm letting those science communicators or teachers and trainers do that work. I'm focusing on not the scientists, because that's basically the bulk of the field is, because people are not putting any emphasis on entertainment. So yes, it's happening. I wish it happened more. It's clearly a failure in social science because I'm learning a lot of these things for the first time, which just seem so fundamental to things that people should know. So I hear you. People are doing it, but not me.
Great. So we have another question. You said that there was data showing the effectiveness of immersion narrative transportation.
Yeah.
Where would we find that?
I'll give you a name right now for this person's probably interested and wants to do a search. Melanie Green is probably the key person, and just even searching her name and her name along with narrative transportation is going to turn up a lot of great references. And if you're a reader of academic papers, you can go from there. There are some summaries. There's a book that she edited, and if you go to your favorite search engine, narrative transportation social science will probably turn up a lot. And whoever's asking, you can reach me directly. I'll give you the papers that I think are the best ones.
Okay.
If you want that.
Great, thank you. Here's a long question. How would you characterize the difference between the liberal media and conservative media? The book Network Propaganda by Yochai Benkler, Robert Ferris, and Hal Roberts observes that the right-wing media ecosystem differs categorically from the rest of the media environment, and it has been much more susceptible to disinformation, lies, and half-truths. Apparently, there are two parallel media ecosystems at play out there, which is kind of what I was actually getting to. I just didn't say it very well.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, that's not really the focus of my work, but it is something that's on my mind a lot and actually something I did not present because of the video problem was to speak directly about misinformation. And generally speaking, the conservative media does this stuff that I'm talking about pretty well for misinformation. They do things like appeal to people's values and appeal to the emotion as opposed to the facts. That's pretty fundamental. Some of these things that I've been saying are tactics that are used by propagandists. And again, I'm trying to co-opt them and bring them to the good side. But when you hear things like it's like a flu, that sounds reasonable. Yeah, it's like a flu. Okay, I believe that. Someone in authority is saying that. That sounds reasonable. I believe it. It matches up with my values and beliefs. I know what the flu is. We might believe that antibiotics work against viruses. Okay, there's thoughts like the creation of 5G and the erection of 5G cell towers seems to coincide with the creation of COVID. Therefore, they're related. And so we have people in the UK who are burning down 5G towers, presumably because they think there's a connection to COVID. So we know all these things. We know that it's not just the credibility of the person. It's not just the logic of the statement. It's not just the facts. It is these other things that the sort of propaganda side of the media does pretty well. They buy into that social proof, that the things that your people in your circle would believe, and try to give you information that's compatible with your beliefs. And again, that makes the thing I called, which I didn't dive into a lot of, this thing called processing fluency. It makes it very easy. They're making it very easy to take up this information and believe it and incorporate into your thoughts. So yeah, the approaches are there. They're being used. A lot of these things that I've been talking about are actually being used very effectively by propagandists.
Kathy, you had a question?
Hello. I just wondered if you were pulling from Jonathan Haidt's work at all, and specifically about applying the family inheritance for trait openness that he talks about in kind of targeting the whole family in shows. So I'm wondering if you're thinking about that holistically in terms of family persuasion or how the family breaks down. And then secondly, I'm very curious about his ideas around morality between liberals and conservatives. So I'm wondering if there's any simple tips that you could share around messaging middle ground morality to reach conservatives but not alienate liberals. And I realize that's a big question.
Yeah. So it was actually the first thing that I turned to when I was trying to think about, I was thinking about values, because obviously the first thing I realized was that it's filtered through these values, and that was the first place that I knew to go to. You can see that that moral foundations theory actually can be mapped onto ideologies in some of the same ways that I mentioned the TV show traits. So absolutely. Have I specifically been looking at the family question? I haven't actually, but I do believe that you can do that and map it. There's not as much work. Actually, there's very little work generally taking values and trying to convert them into TV show traits. It's actually very unusual. So you'll have to sort of make a little bit of a leap to say, okay, well, that's the value. So how can I turn that into a narrative with my character? Or how can I, if you're in nonfiction, how can I show that a nonfiction character is exuding that value when it's obviously not manipulating the value has to be true, but your awareness is 90% of getting there. So yeah, to answer your question, yes, absolutely, it's definitely there. I did not present any of it, I sort of just mentioned it as a buzzword, but yeah, because there's a lot of mapping there to ideology, it's really useful to think about.
Question from Nadav.
Hi.
Nadav.
For this wonderful talk. And I guess I have a question that has to do with, I mean, we're in a weird state right now where it seems like there's more consensus in a way among broad swaths of the public around things like entertainment, kind of figures, right? Like the ones you mentioned, then around scientific facts, for example. And this approach of kind of creating or kind of customizing the persuasive entertainment products that you create to specific publics, it's in an interesting way can potentially kind of feed into this further fragmentation, right? So I'm kind of just trying to think how far this can go, or this idea of, just to be more relatable, right? You would create multiple versions of the same show for, East Coast, Latinx, urban population, and then for a Midwestern white conservative population. And so like, how far would that go? And is there an issue there or a potential risk there of, increasing fragmentation even more?
Can you ask your question again? I missed.
Is it, I don't know if that's something that you're interested in or pursuing, or maybe others are, but with this idea of creating the most relatable kind of content that you can, right? Is there this process of customizing it,
yeah,
right,
okay,
for very specific needs, or even creating multiple versions of the same thing? And how far does that go?
Yeah, so I haven't discarded that idea. I did think about that. In the parlance of product development, I thought about A/B testing my shows, so that you would have one show that sort of works, checks off some boxes, and another version that checks off other boxes. Literally, one of my thoughts was, we're not doing it with the testing, but it was my thought until very late into the production of this current series, that we would show, we would have different levels of fact-splaining, just to help me sort of, use that as a variable. My aim is to go back to what television used to be like 50 years ago, which is broadcast. I would like one show to work for everyone. I'm trying to aim for a show like Manhunt. Some of the shows I didn't mention more specifically, but some of the older shows from the 50s and 60s, the medical shows actually leaned quite conservative and actually had much better science than today. They were dealing with social issues and dealing with new subject matter, and it was broadcast. There wasn't the fragmentation of media. It was like you watch CBS or NBC or ABC or Dumont potentially, and that was it. So I'm trying to come back to that. I'm the opposite of what is sort of best practice today, which is niche and try to find that audience and advertise that audience. I'm trying to find solutions for a broad audience with the same thought that Joan Gans Cooney did. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but this is what I interpret from her work, which is that if we can make this work for disenfranchised kids and not turn off the kids who are not disenfranchised, then maybe we're onto something. That said, I haven't discarded the idea, and there may be some cases where the media only needs to be made for, I'm talking about ideology. Again, your group may be something else. It may be possible that we don't need to make the liberal show. We just need to make the conservative show, and that's all that we do, and that's perfectly fine too. I think that would be productive.
All right, a question here. I wonder, in the graph you showed with access of the level of science-ness and level of conservative, the good science, bad science, liberal, conservative, what kind of measures you used for rating these qualitative aspects of the TV show?
Yeah, so that's very subjective. So actually, some things are subjective and some are not. So the good and bad is obviously it's a very nuanced question. So for example, so I'll just answer that question quickly to say it's very subjective, and we're just doing our best from a liberal educated point of view, what we think is good science. But there's a continuum there as well. And it's multidimensional. It's not single dimensional. We're just trying to attempt to show it in a simple way. So as an example, I mentioned Dana Scully as a great character. The X-Files is actually we scored it like a 50, something like that. It's not a good show for science. It actually potentially helped start this wave of pseudoscience and believing conspiracies because it was a sci-fi show. So even though Dana Scully was a great character, and a great scientist character, the show is actually not a very good science show. So there's definitely a lot of nuance there. The conservative versus liberal question is something else. So we've done that from a few places. Again, we have papers that are trying to connect the show traits to ideology, which does it pretty well. Actually, it's quite accurate. So we use that in combination with survey data that we actually have, and yeah, just sort of triangulating all these things to sort of figure out what the ideologies are. They're not perfect. The ideologies are not perfect. I can sort of just look at them and you can kind of sense that some of them feel a little bit off. But we're doing the best we can with that, which is one of the least scientific things.
Great. So another question, how is your approach related to bogus procedural rhetoric and serious games in general?
I actually I'm not familiar with that, but did you say serious games?
Serious games. Games that try to teach you something.
Yeah, I know serious games.
You
know, I have purposefully not tried to venture into games, comic books, songs, even film, because some of those things are outside my expertise. I suspect there are some things to take, but I'm not sure what they are. There may be some of the parameters may be a little different. So in short, I've not looked at games, but I'd be interested if you're interested that we could have a conversation about that.
All right, another question. Referring to one of your 2 slides that you shared with Good Bad Science, I would like to know where would you place the previous shows such as MacGyver from the 80s?
It's a good question. I'd probably have to rewatch the shows. I would guess it's probably somewhere in the middle for ideology and for science. Actually did watch MacGyver. I got an old DVD of MacGyver and watched the first season, which is quite hilarious. I'm not sure. I couldn't give you a good answer. I presume it's not 100 in terms of the science, and it's episodic, which is a plus. And again, there's potentially some level of hierarchical structure. Yeah, I would say probably somewhere in the middle for both those things. But now that you've mentioned it, I'm gonna go find a few episodes of MacGyver and score them more specifically. Of course, MacGyver is famously like using duct tape to solve problems, and there could be something there. Although if I recall, the first episode didn't have a lot of science. Remember the pilot. Anyways, I'm gonna look into that. But thanks for the question.
Question from Kat.
Thanks, Adnaan. That's a wonderful presentation and great initiative. I'm just wondering, to follow on the last question, is there a sort of a Bechdel test that could be sort of released about the science of what we consume and evaluating fact-explaining? I mean, maybe that's also another layer of like this meta media analysis that people can be a part of.
Yes, Kat, thank you. We actually have done that. So it's much more complicated than Bechdel test. So Bechdel test is like 3 parameters. We actually literally have looked at, I forgot the number, 65 questions, or I think it's almost 100 questions actually. This is when I was saying like the PCA analysis, that's where this is coming in. So, which is some complicated math. We asked a lot of questions of the media. So things like, is the main character a male? Is there even like really strange questions like, is there bubbling apparatus in the background? We really want to ask every question, and found what we actually found from this was what we would like to do is have it be, again, this is something that's a little less scientific because we're just sort of like grouping factors together and saying, oh, maybe these questions or something. The thing that we actually noticed was quite disheartening from doing this science. Right now, we're just calling it a science TV index, which is the more that a writer attempts to put science in the show, the worse the science is. So that's the state of science today. That's like the #1 factor for bad science in the show is how much science there is. The more science there is, actually, the worse it is, which is it's just a statement on the state of science in television today. The second point I think I said, which was the second biggest factor of how if you have bad science in the show is if your lead scientist character is a man. And you can think of it as if your lead scientist character is a man or if your lead scientist character is a woman, sort of the inverse. If your lead scientist character is a woman, it's like, my guess is it's more likely that you are, woke enough to realize there's a lot of other things going on. So that filters down into the rest of the script. Whereas if your lead character is a man, it's less likely you have thought about those things. So the script is actually worse. So if your main character is a man is actually the number 2 worst factor. So right now, the way that this index is laid out, it's more kind of a commentary on the state of science television today, but we're trying to rewrite that to be much more diagnostic. When you make a science show, these are you don't have to answer 100 questions, although you could look at the 100 questions. If you do these 5 or 10 things, then you can score pretty highly and know that you're doing a pretty good job.
Just quickly, is it a public process that we can see, or is this just part of your
I haven't shared it yet. It's still to come.
I think it could really fly.
I agree. Actually, I think it's one of those things where I think it's one of those things that will actually be of the most interest, because actually, my goal is not to speak to documentary filmmakers. My goal is to have media producers make better media in Hollywood. So to have things like the Science Index, where people can fill out a checklist and see what they are doing well or not well. We also have in Hollywood, there's a coverage forum. So when a script comes in, people evaluate, how good are the characters. We actually have an addendum to the coverage forum, which is for Persuasive Entertainment. So we're making all these tools for media producers to do a better job. And it's not to say that a documentary filmmaker couldn't also look at those same lists, but we're trying to look at, narrative transportation and whether the scientists are portrayed well and down the line.
Great. We have a question here. I've worked in journalism for years. I've talked a lot with my colleagues about the behavior psychology you have referenced and how simply telling the facts isn't always effective, but they are very resistant to changing their approach. I feel documentarians are more open to other approaches such as persuasive entertainment. Have you ideas of how we can also talk to journalists about changing their approach, which I think piggybacks on what you just said?
I think I'm trying to do that with this talk. Maybe you've already been won over. More of this. I think as there's more media that you can actually point to, because no show has been released yet. They're coming out soon. That I'll be able to point to them and say, look, this is what I was talking about. These are the implementations, and we'll be able to have more research on those shows to be able to say it works. I feel for you though, because this is not intuitive, and I've heard this from journalists. And if I can, again, generalize where journalists are coming from, the editors don't know. They're worried about deadlines, and I'm not trying to be insulting to people, but the focus is on wordsmithing sometimes, and sometimes the impact is not the first thing a writer is thinking about. Even if it's the back of their mind, they might not think about it. I've also, sorry to just diverge from journalism for a second, when I hear Hollywood writers say they really want to make an impact, they don't know the social science, so they don't know the tools, they don't know how to do it. They want to, but they don't know. So I feel for you. I hope more people be won over by persuasive entertainment, and there'll be more PowerPoint presentations or videos. Actually, I'm actually planning on creating a series of videos to help the concept. So maybe that's something to share. The data may not help. It may be, again, trying to use the techniques of persuasive entertainment to try to persuade your colleagues that this is an approach to try, and that may be also a way to frame it, which is do it as an experiment. Try it on the side. Try this enterprise story this one way, and see if that has an impact. I have had the privilege of working with the New York Times, which just does a lot of innovative things with video, not just in documentary, but is trying to think about new forms. And of course, I've worked in new formats and short form as well. These are things to try, and if they have an impact, then you can piggyback on those things or leverage them.
We have a question here in the Q&A. Is your audience, if your audience is, for instance, misogynistic, how do you reach them with characters that defy their ideology? Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't have a specific answer to that question. I'm not trying to solve the Big Bang Theory or Rick and Morty. The idea would be to, not necessarily create a racist character, or a misogynistic character,
but you could try to understand what the values are of that person and have that character go on a journey. So for example, we have an episode of a show that you'll see at one point where a character essentially believes in pseudoscience. And over the course of the episode, she goes on a journey and realizes maybe I should be asking questions a different way because the way that I'm approaching this question is giving me the wrong answer. So the character has that epiphany, goes on that journey. And the hope is, again, with narrative transportation, that you are empathizing with that character, taking on their worldview, so that when you leave that story, that you also take on that worldview. So again, I'm not suggesting you create a misogynistic character, but there could be some aspect of making a character that shares some of those beliefs and values and have them go on a journey, and then the idea is that someone who might resonate with that character may also go on that journey. There's actually an example. I know it's not the same about misogyny, but racism was All in the Family was also an example of a racist character, a Norman Lear show, who obviously attacked a lot of social issues head on. And is still going strong. And there's some conflicting data, but I think the sort of the lasting data is the one that said that actually that was a net positive.
Okay, we have a question here from Tara.
Oh, hi, thanks so much. Hi, for the presentation, and thank you, Tara, for helping me get logged in. I heard the whole presentation.
Oh, you're not Tara.
I'm Josh, friend of
Hi,
Tara,
Josh.
colleague
Okay.
of Tara. And I heard the presentation, but I was getting sort of bounced out of the Q&A for the past 20 minutes. I'm so sorry if this has already been addressed, but I really loved the presentation, and those, specifically those graphs, were fascinating, and I'm still thinking about them. But I had a question, I guess, just about some of your research and sort of assessing maybe the pedagogical potential or value of a lot of this kind of media, and to what extent you take into account the kind of context of, say, viewing or maybe discussion, kind of back and forth between viewers about what they've just seen. Because just, in terms of being an educator and being in the classroom, so much of, awareness, potential change of view, dialogue, that is where so much of the learning happens. And I'm just curious, in a lot of the sort of studies and research and data that you're looking at, where that kind of pedagogical sort of context is looked at.
So thanks, Josh. So much less of that. I think just the reality of what I'm doing is I can't explore. I can't go that far, and from a research perspective. But from my previous work has informed the approach, and a lot of the thought was, I name dropped the Whiteness Project. There were tens of thousands of conversations online that we tracked, about that project, that were essentially overwhelmingly, almost completely positive and constructive, and the whole point of where I used to work before was not about educating, not about activism. It was about conversation. So the fact that we could stoke a conversation and have a positive conversation was really important to me. So everything I'm constructing right now is meant to be transported on social media, and has all these hooks to act like objects that can be passed around on social media. So I don't mean like memes. I mean like the episodes themselves are on social media, can get passed around. The hope is that because they've been constructed in that way, that people will have those conversations. Mm-hmm. But the way that I've usually spoken to this, because when I talk to educators, they're like, oh, and you're creating all this additional educational material, right? So that people can actually learn, right? And I would say that, and when I talk to educators, I'd say that's your job. I'm making the show. Now that people are curious and want to get that information, please, can you have that information ready for them? And can you please write the lesson plan? And can you please connect it to curriculum? And so I had a conversation with a professor about, so maybe that's the answer to your question, but just digressing a little bit. I had a conversation with a professor about one of our shows, which is about falsifiability. If people know what that is, it's Karl Popper and epistemology. It's like really kind of in the weeds sort of things. But we never mentioned the word epistemology, but that's what the episode's about. And a professor was saying, I can show this to my students and they will finally understand what falsifiability is, because they won't get it otherwise. And that's what I'm hoping will happen more, that people will see these episodes, they'll realize, oh, there's an opportunity there, or maybe there's more funding and we can work more on the pedagogical side and, you know, have the educators create that content. Because again, we still want that, because right now, really the way I'm testing things is there's a question like, did you go to Wikipedia to find out more? Because that's all I have, because we don't have the content. But I hope eventually that there would be, if I'm not, or someone in my sphere is not making them, I hope someone else would.
All right, time is running out. We have, I'll give you one more question. And this says, thank you for the presentation. What is the difference in your view between an educational documentary and a doc framed as persuasive, entertainment?
Thanks for the question. You know, I actually, I usually don't consider a documentary to be persuasive. You know, the best definition I have for persuasive entertainment is that it is fiction and not nonfiction. So, but I think you're also you're trying to categorize things when there doesn't need to be categorization. I think there's a continuum of these things. I feel like everything to some level is educational. And there could be both. Maybe you're not ready to discard everything you've done and you just want to have, you know, a little bit of narrative or a little bit of a mixture of a hybrid documentary. You may not want to discard what you've done already, or you can take some of these ideas and try to incorporate them and see how they work for you. But I don't really see documentaries as a perfect form for persuasive entertainment. I really feel like it's the realm of fiction, because, and the main reason isn't because it's not possible. Obviously, documentaries are usually narrative. The good ones, the great ones are. They don't have to be, but I think the great ones are. When you construct everything yourself in fiction, you're able to control these variables. So when you have a character, you're not going to be able to mold them to become more relatable. They're going to be who they are. I mean, obviously you can manipulate that as an editor, as a documentary filmmaker. But fiction lets you construct everything. The context, the characters, the situations, the journey, and that just means you can pull those levers a lot more easily.
All right, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Adnaan. That was fantastic and inspiring. I think there's several people who want to continue the conversation with you, and people are asking how they can reach you. What is the best way to follow up or reach you in general?
The best way to email me is very easy to remember, hello@adnaan.com. So you can spell my name. And of course, you can connect me on social media, and I'm happy to talk with you that way as well.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.